I never thought a simple family gathering could turn my world upside down. But sometimes the people closest to you are the ones who hurt you the most. My name is Amara, and this is my story about standing up for myself when I had almost forgotten how. It started on a Wednesday morning when my phone buzzed with a message from my daughter-in-law, Natasha. We weren't close, not really. Our conversations were always surface level, pleasant but distant, like two people dancing around an invisible barrier neither of us dared to cross. So when her name appeared on my screen, I felt a flutter of curiosity mixed with caution. "Hi Amara," the message read. "We're having dinner at Le Jardin this Saturday evening with my mother, Vivian. Would love for you to join us. It would be nice to spend some quality time together." Le Jardin was one of those upscale French restaurants downtown, where the waiters wore crisp white shirts and the wine list was thicker than most novels. It wasn't the kind of place you just casually suggested for a family dinner unless there was something more to it. But what? Was this Natasha's way of reaching out? Was she finally ready to bridge that gap between us? Part of me wanted to decline. My relationship with Natasha had always been complicated. She was beautiful, sophisticated, and came from a wealthy family that made my middle-class background seem almost quaint by comparison. When my son Adrian married her 3 years ago, I had hoped we would grow closer over time, but instead, the distance between us only seemed to widen. Still, I told myself this could be different. Maybe she genuinely wanted to connect. "I'd love to come," I typed back, keeping my response warm but not over-eager. "Thank you for thinking of me." Her reply came almost instantly. A simple thumbs-up emoji. No warmth, no elaboration, just acknowledgement. I tried not to read too much into it. The days leading up to Saturday were filled with an odd mixture of anticipation and anxiety. I changed my outfit 3 times before finally settling on a deep burgundy dress with a pearl necklace my late mother had given me. I wanted to look presentable, but not like I was trying too hard. When I looked at myself in the mirror that evening, I saw a woman in her late 50s who had weathered life's storms with grace, or at least that's what I told myself. I arrived at Le Jardin exactly on time. The restaurant was as elegant as I remembered, all soft lighting and hushed conversations, with the gentle clink of crystal glasses providing a delicate soundtrack. Adrian spotted me first and waved me over to a corner table where he sat next to Natasha. Across from them was a woman who could only be Vivian. She was striking in a way that demanded attention. Her silver hair was styled in an elaborate updo, and she wore a designer dress that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. When she stood to greet me, her smile was wide and practiced, but her eyes conducted a swift evaluation that made me feel like I was being appraised rather than welcomed. "So you're the famous Amara," she said, her voice carrying a musical quality that somehow made the compliment feel like a question mark. "I've heard so much about you." I returned her smile and took my seat, already feeling the weight of her scrutiny. The waiter appeared immediately, as if summoned by some invisible signal. Vivian chose a vintage wine I'd never heard of, speaking to the waiter in flawless French that made me acutely aware of my own linguistic limitations. The conversation began innocuously enough. We discussed the menu, the recent cold snap, and a new art exhibition opening downtown. But there was something about the way Vivian asked her questions that put me on edge. She wanted to know about my work as a librarian, my hobbies, my living situation, even the color scheme I'd chosen for my bedroom. Each question felt less like genuine interest and more like she was building a mental file on me. Natasha watched our exchange with that familiar distant smile, her eyes moving between her mother and me like she was a spectator at a tennis match. Adrian was quiet, stirring his drink more than drinking it, and I could see the tension in his shoulders even from across the table. When the waiter came to take our orders, Vivian leaned back in her chair and said with a light laugh, "I bet Amara will order something simple. You probably don't get to eat at places like this very often, do you?" She said it as though she were making an observation about the weather, casual and conversational, but I felt my face grow warm. I ordered the salmon, keeping my voice steady, and watched Adrian shift uncomfortably in his seat. He opened his mouth as if to say something, then closed it again, taking a long sip of water instead. As our meals arrived, I noticed that every answer I gave to Vivian's probing questions was met with a raised eyebrow or a knowing smile. She had a way of responding that made me feel like I was being gently mocked, though I couldn't quite put my finger on how. When I mentioned that I enjoyed reading mystery novels, she chuckled and said, "How quaint. I suppose we all need our little escapes from reality." The comment hung in the air like smoke, and Natasha's smile widened just slightly. I saw her exchange a quick glance with her mother, a private moment of understanding that excluded both Adrian and me. Throughout the meal, I found myself growing more vigilant, analyzing every word before I spoke, trying to anticipate where the conversation might turn next. The warmth I had hoped to find was nowhere in sight. Instead, I felt like I was navigating a minefield, where any wrong step could trigger an explosion of subtle humiliation. Adrian kept looking at me with worried eyes, but he remained largely silent, trapped between his wife and his mother in a position I knew all too well. I wanted to reach out to him, to tell him it was okay, but the truth was, it wasn't okay. Nothing about this evening felt okay. By the time we finished our main courses, my appetite had all but disappeared. I pushed the remaining food around my plate, focusing on the patterns the sauce made, rather than engaging in more conversation. That's when Vivian delivered what felt like her calculated blow. We were discussing holiday traditions when I mentioned that I baked special cookies every Christmas, a tradition I'd started when Adrian was just a little boy. It was one of my favorite memories, standing in the kitchen with flour on our hands and laughter filling the house. Vivian took a delicate sip of her wine and said, "How sweet. I suppose when you don't have much else filling your days, these little rituals become quite important, don't they?" The words landed like a slap. I felt my fork freeze halfway to my mouth, my entire body tensing. Adrian's eyes widened, and for the first time all evening, he spoke up. "Mom's traditions are special," he said quietly, his voice strained. "They mean a lot to our family." It was a small defense, barely audible over the ambient noise of the restaurant, but I appreciated it more than he could know. Natasha glanced at him but said nothing, and Vivian simply smiled wider, as if his comment had been a charming interruption rather than a challenge to her behavior. "Of course they are, darling," Vivian said smoothly, patting Adrian's hand. "I didn't mean anything by it. Some people just find joy in simpler pleasures, and there's nothing wrong with that." But there was everything wrong with it. The way she said simpler pleasures made my life sound small and insignificant, as though my choices and my happiness were somehow less valid than hers. The rest of dinner passed in a blur of forced pleasantries. When the dessert menu arrived, I declined, claiming I was too full, though the truth was I couldn't stomach another minute of this performance. Vivian and Natasha ordered tiramisu to share, discussing the merits of Italian desserts while I sat in silence, feeling more invisible with each passing moment. When the bill finally came, the waiter placed it in the center of the table. Adrian reached for it immediately, but Vivian pushed it toward him with a smile and said, "Well, you're the man of the family, aren't you? This is your responsibility." Adrian didn't laugh. He simply took the bill, inserted his credit card, and waited for the waiter to return. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken tension. As we gathered our things to leave, Vivian leaned back in her chair and swirled the last of her wine. "Well," she said, looking directly at me, "I suppose we can call this a successful evening. No one walked out, so that's something." Adrian's eyes met mine across the table, and in that brief moment I saw exhaustion, apology, and perhaps even guilt. I knew he was torn between protecting me and maintaining peace with his wife's family, and I couldn't blame him for his silence. This wasn't a battle that could be won in one night. We all stood and made our way toward the exit. The cool night air beckoned through the glass doors, and I focused on that promise of escape, of being able to breathe freely again. But just as I was slinging my purse over my shoulder, Natasha let out a little laugh that made my skin prickle. "Well, Mother," she said, her voice light and playful, "you didn't scare her off." She made it through the whole dinner. Vivienne laughed too, tilting her head at me, as if we were all sharing some wonderful inside joke. I was wondering if she would, she replied, her eyes twinkling with amusement that felt anything but kind. I forced myself to smile, though my stomach was churning. Why would I be scared off? I asked, keeping my voice level and giving them a chance to backtrack, to pretend this was all just harmless fun. Vivienne's smirk deepened. You know, she said, my sense of humor isn't for everyone. Some people just can't handle a little sarcasm. The way she said it made it perfectly clear that she saw nothing wrong with any of her comments throughout the evening. Natasha added, It's true, Mom's jokes can be a bit much if you're not used to them. She looked at me as she spoke, and there was a challenge in her expression, as if she were daring me to admit I'd been uncomfortable. I refused to give her that satisfaction. I can handle a joke just fine, I said, my voice steady, despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. That's when Vivienne leaned in slightly, lowering her voice just enough to create an illusion of intimacy while still being audible to everyone. Good, she said, because some people would be in tears by now. She laughed again, and this time Natasha joined her without hesitation. It wasn't the kind of laughter that invites you in. It was the kind that shuts you out completely, that makes you the punchline of a joke you didn't know you were part of. Something shifted inside me in that moment. I realized this wasn't about humor or personality differences. This was about power, about putting me in my place while maintaining plausible deniability. And the worst part was seeing Natasha encourage it, feeding off her mother's cruelty with that knowing smile. The waiter returned with Adrian's credit card, and my son quietly thanked him before tucking the receipt into his wallet. He glanced at me, searching my face for some kind of signal, but I kept my expression neutral. I wasn't going to let them see how much this was affecting me. We started walking toward the lobby, and I could feel Vivienne's satisfaction radiating from her like heat. She kept talking, weaving her comments into what sounded like innocent observations, each one carrying another subtle sting that only I seemed to fully register. When we reached the entrance, Natasha made one final comment that would echo in my mind for days to come. She gestured toward her mother with a smile and said, You know, Amara, if you don't like Mother's sarcastic jokes, next time you can just pay the bill and leave. She delivered it as if it were perfectly reasonable advice, and both she and Vivienne laughed like it was the funniest thing they'd heard all evening. I stopped walking, letting the words sink in. It wasn't subtle anymore. It was a direct challenge, a test to see if I would finally react. Adrian's head snapped toward his wife, his expression a mixture of disbelief and anger. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, I looked at Natasha and said simply, I'll keep that in mind. My tone was quiet, almost too quiet, and I saw something flicker across her face. Surprise maybe, or disappointment that I hadn't taken the bait and given them the seam they seemed to want. We stepped out into the cool night air, and I let the breeze wash over me, trying to calm the heat in my chest. The parking lot stretched out before us, and I could hear the distant hum of traffic on the main road. Vivienne and Natasha walked ahead, their heads tilted toward each other as they continued their private conversation, laughing softly about something I couldn't hear and probably didn't want to. Adrian trailed behind them, his shoulders hunched, his gaze fixed on the ground. I knew that posture. I had seen it when he was a boy, and something troubled him deeply. Back then, I could wrap my arms around him and tell him everything would be okay. Now the distance between us felt vast and unbridgeable. If you feel my words, show your support by liking the video and subscribing to the channel. And tell me from which city you belong, so I can see how far a woman's impactful voice can reach. Help me build this community so we can bring more truthful stories for you. I decided to try to shift the tone as we walked. My instinct told me that if we parted on this bitter note, the resentment would only grow deeper, so I quickened my pace and walked up beside them. What a beautiful night, I said, looking up at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Makes you want to take the scenic route home. Natasha glanced at me, her expression unreadable, before looking back at her mother. It's a bit chilly, she replied flatly. Vivienne offered me that same practiced smile. It's lovely, she said, though you don't strike me as someone who enjoys being out late. There it was again, another subtle dig, wrapped in polite conversation. I didn't take the bait. I enjoy good company, no matter the hour, I said, meaning every word, and hoping it might prompt some reflection. For a moment there was silence, as if they were deciding how to respond. Then, Natasha let out a small laugh, the kind that holds no real humor. Well, you'll have to get used to us then. We reached our cars, and I pointed to mine parked a few spaces away. It was good seeing you all, I said, keeping my voice cordial, even though I felt anything but cordial inside. Adrian walked over to me, separating himself from Natasha and Vivian for the first time all evening. That's when Vivian spoke up again. "Oh, we'll definitely have to do this again," she said. "Maybe next time we'll go somewhere even fancier. Really test your patience with my humor." She laughed, and her daughter joined in. I forced another smile, though this one was harder to maintain. Adrian's jaw tightened visibly, and I could see he'd finally had enough. "That's enough, Vivian," he said, his voice quiet but carrying an unmistakable firmness. The laughter stopped abruptly. Natasha turned to him, her eyebrows raised in surprise. Vivian gave an awkward laugh, trying to smooth over the tension. "I was just joking," she said lightly. But Adrian didn't respond. Instead, he opened my car door for me, something he hadn't done in years, and gave my hand a gentle squeeze. It was a small gesture, but it communicated everything he couldn't say in front of them. He was sorry, and he wanted me to know it. I got into the car, still trying to maintain my composure. I hadn't lashed out. I hadn't stormed off. I had kept my dignity intact, even though the effort had left me exhausted. As Adrian closed the door, I started the engine and watched him pause for a moment, looking at his wife with an expression that was somewhere between frustrated and disappointed. As I pulled away from the restaurant, the lights fading in my rearview mirror, I let out a long breath I'd been holding since the appetizers arrived. The evening replayed in my mind like a film I couldn't stop watching, each frame showing me another moment where I'd been diminished, mocked, or excluded. But something else was forming in my mind too, something harder and more resolute. I had spent years being accommodating, swallowing my pride, and telling myself that keeping the peace was more important than standing up for myself. Tonight had shown me the cost of that choice. When I got home, I sat in my car for a long time, the engine ticking as it cooled, the silence of my driveway wrapping around me like a blanket. I thought about Vivian's comments, about Natasha's passive smile that had never wavered throughout the entire evening, about Adrian's conflicted expression as he watched his mother being torn down by the people he loved. That smile of Natasha's bothered me more than anything else. She had never openly insulted me, not once. She didn't have to. Every time her mother spoke, Natasha would offer that slight, knowing smile, sometimes glancing in my direction to gauge my reaction. If Vivienne's words were the weapon, Natasha's smile was the silent permission to keep firing. I had always believed that silence could be mutual, that staying quiet meant staying out of conflict. But that night taught me differently. Silence can be as loud as words when it's paired with that kind of smile. And Natasha's smile hadn't been there to ease tension or build bridges. It had been there to hold the door open while her mother did the dirty work. The next morning, Adrian called. His voice was cautious, measured, like he was approaching a wounded animal he didn't want to startle. He asked if I'd made it home safely, and after a pause that felt heavy with everything unsaid, he apologized. Not for himself, but for them. "I didn't know it would be like that," he said, and I could hear the strain in his voice, the frustration simmering just beneath the surface. "I didn't expect them to. I'm sorry, Mum." I wanted to ask him why he hadn't said something sooner, why he'd let it go on for so long. But I didn't. I could tell he was already struggling with his own guilt, torn between his loyalty to me and his desire to keep peace in his marriage. Instead, I told him it was okay, that I hadn't taken it personally, even though I had. I told him it was forgotten, even though it wasn't. For the next few days, I tried to go about my life as usual. I went to work at the library, organized the children's reading hour, had coffee with my friend Miriam, who listened patiently as I recounted the evening without offering judgment. But the memory of that dinner followed me everywhere, playing on a loop in my mind. I found myself replaying moments I hadn't fully processed in the moment. The way Natasha would lean toward her mother when Vivian spoke, the subtle nods of agreement, the slight curl of her lip when I tried to change the subject. She hadn't been an observer. She had been a participant, just a quieter, more insidious one. By the end of that week, I realized something crucial. The hardest part wasn't enduring the sarcasm or the thinly veiled insults. It was knowing that the person who should have been the bridge between her family and mine had chosen to stand on the other side. That kind of silent alignment hurt more than open hostility, because it made me question everything. If Natasha could sit through that dinner and not once step in to soften the blows, what did that say about how she saw me? Was I just an obligation to her, a box to check in her duties as a daughter-in-law? Or was there something deeper, something more troubling at play? I couldn't pretend it hadn't happened. The weight of it sat on my chest like a stone, and I knew that if I didn't address it somehow, the unspoken tension would poison every future interaction we had. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. The following Saturday, Adrian called to invite me over for lunch at their house. He made a point of mentioning that Vivian wouldn't be there, just the three of us. I agreed, partly because I missed my son, and partly because I wanted to see if things would be different without her mother's influence. When I arrived, their home smelled of roasted chicken and herbs. Natasha greeted me at the door with a smile that seemed softer than usual, more genuine perhaps. She offered me iced tea, and for a while, everything felt almost normal. We sat around their dining table, making small talk about the neighborhood, a new cafe that had opened nearby, the upcoming summer heat. But as the conversation continued, I noticed subtle shifts. Natasha began asking more personal questions, the kind that venture into territory I usually kept private. She wanted to know if I'd dated anyone since my divorce years ago, how I spent my evenings, whether I ever felt lonely living by myself. I answered carefully, trying to keep the conversation light, but I could feel us drifting into dangerous waters. Then, without warning, she leaned back in her chair and let out a small laugh. "Well, at least you have your baking in your garden," she said. "That's something. Not everyone your age has hobbies to keep them occupied." The words hung in the air, and I felt my face flush. It wasn't just a reference to her mother's comments. She was making them her own, claiming that same mocking tone as if she'd inherited it like a family heirloom. Before I could respond, she continued. "I mean, it's really sweet," she added, "how you've built this nice little life for yourself. You don't need much to be happy." She said it like a compliment, but it was phrased in a way that made my existence sound small and simple, as if my life were nothing more than a modest collection of plants and pastries that barely registered on the scale of meaningful living. Adrian's fork froze halfway to his mouth. His eyes shot from me to Natasha, and I could see the shift in his expression the moment he realized what she'd just done. "Why would you say that?" he asked, his tone quiet, but edged with something harder than I'd heard from him before. Natasha looked surprised, as if she hadn't expected him to challenge her. "I'm just making conversation," she said lightly. "You know, the way Mum does." His jaw tightened. "We saw how that ended last time. Do you really think that's a good idea?" The air in the room went still. Natasha glanced at me, perhaps expecting me to jump in and smooth things over, to laugh it off and move past the awkwardness. For once, I wanted her to sit with the discomfort, to feel what it was like to have her words examined and found lacking. Her smile faltered, though she tried to recover quickly. "I didn't mean anything by it," she said, reaching for her glass of water. Adrian didn't respond immediately. He just looked at her, and in that silence, the message was unmistakable. He wasn't going to pretend this was harmless anymore. The free pass had expired. The rest of the meal was subdued. Adrian asked me about my week, and I answered gratefully, relieved to have the focus shift to safer ground. Natasha chimed in occasionally, but her comments were softer now, more cautious, as if she'd suddenly realized that the dynamic had shifted, and her words would no longer go unchallenged. When it was time for me to leave, Adrian walked me to the door. He paused, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry," he said again. "I should have stepped in sooner last time." I told him it was okay, though we both knew that wasn't entirely true. But it mattered that he had spoken up now, that he was beginning to see the pattern for what it was. That was enough for the moment. As I drove home, I thought about how quickly things can change when someone finally refuses to play along. The comment Natasha made had crossed a line, and in doing so, it had forced Adrian to draw one of his own. I had a feeling that from this point forward, she would be much more careful with her words, at least when he was around. But I also knew this wasn't over. Patterns like these don't disappear overnight. They're woven into the fabric of relationships, and unraveling them takes time, patience, and vigilance. 2 weeks later, we found ourselves in the same room again. Adrian had called to say they were having a casual Sunday lunch, and that Vivian would be there too. He sounded almost apologetic as he extended the invitation, as if he were bracing for me to decline. Part of me wanted to. The memory of that first dinner was still fresh, and the idea of sitting across from Vivian again made my stomach tighten with anxiety. But another part of me didn't want to give them the satisfaction of thinking they'd driven me away. So I agreed, telling myself I would stay calm and leave at the first sign of trouble. When I arrived, the atmosphere felt different right from the start. Natasha's smile was a little too bright, like she was overcompensating for something. Vivian was already seated in the living room with a cup of tea, and she glanced up as I walked in, offering a brief nod before returning to her conversation with another guest. Lunch started politely. We talked about the weather, a new community center being built downtown, and the landscaping work Adrian and Natasha were planning for their backyard. I listened, nodded, and even contributed when appropriate. For a little while, I thought maybe this would be different. But then as we were clearing the plates, Vivian leaned toward me, with that familiar, calculated smile. "Still keeping busy with your hobbies, I see," she said, drawing out the last word in a way that made my pulse quicken. I felt the heat rise in my neck. Adrian froze for a second, but before he could say anything, Natasha jumped in. "She means the baking and the gardening," she added sweetly. "You're certainly dedicated to those." The pause before her words and the slight curl of her lip told me she was fully aware of the double meaning. My heart pounded in my ears, drowning out the other sounds in the room. I looked at Adrian, and he was already watching me, his expression cautious and concerned. I could tell he was waiting to see how I would respond, whether I would finally push back or continue to absorb their comments in silence. I forced a small laugh, though my throat felt tight. "Yes, I still enjoy them," I said, keeping my tone as neutral as I could manage. "They've served me well over the years. I thought that would be the end of it, that we could move past this moment and finish lunch without further incident." But Vivian leaned back in her chair and said, "How nice. Some people need bigger things to feel fulfilled, but it's sweet that you're content with such simple pleasures." In that moment, something inside me shifted. I could see Adrian's jaw clench, his fist tightening slightly on the edge of the table. And then he spoke, his voice firm but quiet. "That's enough," he said. Vivienne blinked, clearly surprised. "What?" she asked, feigning innocence. "You've made these kinds of comments before," Adrian continued, his tone leaving no room for argument. "And I'm asking you to stop. They're not funny, and they're not harmless." The room went completely silent. Even the ambient sounds from the kitchen seemed to fade into nothingness. Vivienne raised her eyebrows but said nothing, perhaps realizing this wasn't something she could simply brush off, with a laugh and a wave of her hand. Natasha opened her mouth as if to speak, but Adrian turned to her as well. "And that goes for you too," he said. "We're not doing this anymore." I stayed quiet, partly from shock, and partly because I didn't want to make this moment about me inserting myself into their family dynamic. This was Adrian finally taking ownership of the space he occupied in this family, drawing boundaries that should have been established long ago. The silence that followed was heavy and final. The rest of the meal was quiet, the conversation limited to the safest of topics, though it felt like everyone was just filling space with words to avoid the elephant in the room. When it was time to leave, Adrian walked me to the door, as he always did. As I stepped outside, he gave my hand a quick squeeze, just like he had after that first dinner. It was his way of telling me that something had changed. Not just for me, but for him too. On the drive home, my heart finally began to settle, but the echo of its racing reminded me how close I'd come to losing my composure entirely. This time, though, it hadn't been me who set the boundary. It had been Adrian, and that changed everything. What I didn't know then was that his decision to speak up would have consequences that rippled far beyond that Sunday lunch, setting the stage for confrontations neither of us could avoid. It happened just 1 week later. I hadn't expected to see them again so soon, but Adrian called and said they were going out for dinner at a different restaurant, a smaller Italian place called Bella Notte, and he wanted me to join them. He sounded more relaxed than he had in weeks, as if the confrontation at their house had cleared the air somehow. He didn't mention whether Vivian would be there, and I didn't ask. I told myself I would go with an open mind and realistic expectations. When I arrived at Bella Notte, they were already seated at a corner table. Adrian waved me over with a genuine smile. Natasha greeted me politely, and for a moment, I thought maybe this time would truly be different. Then I noticed Vivian sitting beside Natasha, casually scanning the menu, as if she hadn't seen me walk in. She looked up briefly, gave a slight nod, and went back to reading. The meal started quietly enough. The conversation was cordial, even pleasant at times. We talked about the menu, upcoming travel plans, a local art fair happening next month. I relaxed enough to actually enjoy a few bites of my food, without constantly bracing for the next verbal landmine. But as the evening wore on, I could feel the familiar shift in rhythm. The smiles between Natasha and Vivian became more forced, their shared glances more frequent. I recognized the pattern now, the subtle build-up of tension that always preceded the first jab. It came halfway through the meal. Vivian made an offhand comment about people who never venture far from home, and Natasha laughed. It wasn't aimed directly at me, but the implication was clear enough. I ignored it, took a sip of water, and continued eating. I could see it in the way his eyes darted between us, his body language growing tense. Then the conversation shifted to dining preferences and social habits. Vivian began talking about how some people are just too sensitive to enjoy meals out with certain personalities, how they take everything personally, instead of just relaxing and having fun. Natasha turned to me with that same knowing smile and said, "Well, Amara, if you don't like Mother's sarcastic jokes, you can always just pay the bill and leave." The words landed with the force of a slap. My fork stopped mid-air. Adrian's head snapped toward Natasha, his eyes narrowing. I looked at her, and she was smiling calmly, deliberately, as if she'd just made a perfectly reasonable suggestion. Vivian laughed softly, as if it were all harmless banter. I set my fork down carefully. "Is that what you think I should do?" I asked, my tone quiet but devoid of warmth. Natasha shrugged slightly. "I'm just saying, if Mother's sense of humor isn't for you, you don't have to put up with it." Her voice was light, conversational even, but the words were designed to cut. Before I could respond, Adrian stepped in, his voice sharper than I'd ever heard it in public. "That's enough," he said firmly. "That's not a joke, Natasha. It's rude." His wife's smile vanished, her eyes narrowing. "I'm just being honest," she said.
"You're overreacting," Vivian said.
"No," Adrian said, his voice carrying an edge of steel. "I'm not. The two of you have made my mother the target of your jokes more than once, and I'm done pretending it's acceptable. It's not." He looked at Vivian, then back at Natasha. "You can call it sarcasm or humor all you want, but it's not funny if the other person isn't laughing. And she's not." The table fell into a suffocating silence. The tension was so thick I could almost taste it. Vivian cleared her throat, muttered something about not meaning any harm, and reached for her wine glass. Natasha looked away, focusing intently on her plate as if it held the answers to questions she didn't want to ask. I sat in silence too. Not because I had nothing to say, but because Adrian had said it all. He had finally drawn a line in the sand that couldn't be erased, and there was nothing left for me to add. The rest of the meal was brief and awkward. We finished quickly, the conversation limited to the most neutral of topics. When the bill came, Adrian took it without hesitation, placed his card down, and didn't say another word about it. As we stood to leave, he walked beside me toward the exit. His voice was low but steady when he spoke. "You're never going through that again," he told me. I nodded, feeling a strange mixture of relief and sadness wash over me. Relief that he had taken such a firm stand, and sadness that it had taken so long to reach this point. Outside, the cool evening air hit my face, and I realized I was breathing more easily than I had in weeks. That dinner had been ugly and uncomfortable, but it had accomplished something important. A line had been drawn that couldn't be ignored or dismissed. And whatever happened next, one thing was certain. I would never mistake those smiles for innocence again. And if they tried to test those boundaries, they would find I was no longer willing to sit silently and absorb their cruelty. Walking out of Bellinotte that night, I felt like I was stepping out of one life and into another. Adrian's words were still echoing in my mind, louder than the sounds of the street around us. For the first time since this uncomfortable dance began, he had stepped fully into the space between them and me, without hesitation and without looking back to calculate the cost. That realization changed something fundamental in me. I understood in that moment that I had a choice. I could keep showing up, smiling politely, and enduring whatever came my way, or I could finally take control of what I allowed myself to be part of. When we reached my car, Adrian stopped. He didn't say much, just placed his hand gently on my arm and looked at me in a way that communicated more than words ever could. There was weight in his eyes too, the kind that told me he was already thinking about the difficult conversations he'd have with Natasha when they got home. I didn't want to add to that burden, so I simply thanked him and told him I appreciated what he'd done. Then I drove home in silence, my thoughts anything but quiet. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I knew what I had to do. I couldn't keep walking into situations that were designed to undermine my dignity. That didn't mean cutting them out of my life completely, but it meant setting clear boundaries about what I was willing to tolerate. If they wanted to see me, it would be on terms that didn't include me being a silent target for their amusement. That night, I decided I would no longer attend any gathering where Vivian was present, unless I had explicit assurance that respect would be the standard, not the exception. It wasn't about being difficult or creating drama. It was about protecting my peace and my sense of self-worth. The next morning, Adrian called. He sounded tired, but not defeated. He told me he'd talked to Natasha after they got home, and it hadn't gone well. She thought he was being overprotective, that I was being too sensitive, and that he was making a big deal out of nothing. He said he'd reminded her how different things feel when you're on the receiving end of comments designed to shame and diminish, but she just didn't see it that way. I listened without interrupting, letting him get it all out. When he finally paused, I told him I appreciated him standing up for me, but that I also made a decision. I explained that I would no longer put myself in situations where I knew I would be disrespected. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then he said, "I understand, Mom, and I don't blame you." It wasn't an easy conversation, and part of me had hoped he would tell me things would change, that Natasha had apologized and promised to do better. But I'd learned by now that change rarely comes when the people causing harm don't see the problem in the first place. For the rest of that week, I focused on my own life. I rearranged my garden, started reading a new book series, had lunch with Miriam, who told me she was proud of me for finally standing up for myself. The decision to set boundaries stayed with me like an anchor, grounding me in a way I hadn't felt in months. I felt lighter knowing I'd drawn that line, but also a little sad. Family should be the one place where you don't have to fight for basic respect. Still, I reminded myself that dignity isn't something you trade for the sake of appearances or family harmony. If you feel my words, show your support by liking the video and subscribing to the channel. And tell me from which city you belong, so I can see how far a woman's impactful voice can reach. Help me build this community so we can bring more truthful stories for you. The opportunity to test my new boundaries came much sooner than I expected. It was a Saturday afternoon when my phone rang again. Adrian's voice carried that now familiar hesitance, the cautious tone of someone about to ask for something they're not sure will be well received. He told me Natasha was having a small gathering with a few friends and that Vivian would be there too. He quickly added that it wasn't formal, just casual, and that he really wanted me to come. Before I could answer, he promised he would make sure things didn't get out of hand. I sat there weighing my words carefully. Part of me wanted to decline immediately, to hold firm to the boundary I'd set just days before. But the quiet plea in Adrian's voice made me pause. It was about showing Natasha and Vivian that I wasn't going to disappear simply because they'd made me uncomfortable. I agreed, but only after telling him clearly that if things went the way they had before, I would leave without hesitation. No drama, no explanations, just a quiet exit. He said he understood. When I arrived at their house that Saturday, the atmosphere was warmer than I'd imagined. Several of their friends were scattered around the living room. Soft jazz played in the background, and there was animated chatter filling the space. Natasha greeted me at the door with a practiced smile, and Vivian was on the sofa with a glass of wine, talking to another guest. She looked up as I entered, gave me a quick nod, and turned back to her conversation. For the first hour, things went smoothly. I mingled with some of the guests, talked with Adrian about a project he was working on, and even shared a few genuine laughs. It felt almost normal, and I began to relax slightly. But then, as if on cue, the dynamic began to shift. Vivian joined the small group I was talking with, and started discussing how she loved hosting because it gave her a chance to meet all kinds of people, especially those who don't get out much. The words were vague enough to sound innocent, but the slight tilt of her head in my direction made the target clear. I saw Adrian's expression change from across the room. He was mid-conversation with someone else, but as soon as he noticed what was happening, he excused himself and walked straight toward us. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his tone quiet but firm enough to get everyone's attention. Natasha quickly stepped in, her voice light and dismissive. "There's no problem," she said. "Mother was just making a joke." But Adrian wasn't looking at her. His eyes were fixed on Vivian. "You've done this before," he said, his voice steady but sharper now, "and I've told you it needs to stop." The room fell quiet. Even the background music seemed suddenly too loud. Vivian blinked, clearly taken aback by how direct he was being in front of their guests. "I didn't mean anything by it," she said defensively. "That's the same excuse you always use," Adrian replied without missing a beat. "If you don't mean anything by it, then stop saying it." He didn't raise his voice, but the clipped, controlled tone left absolutely no room for argument. Natasha shifted uncomfortably beside him, her gaze flickering between her husband and her mother. I could tell she wanted to intervene, to smooth things over, and restore the pleasant atmosphere. But she didn't. I stood there in silence, letting him handle it. This wasn't my fight anymore. It was his, and the way he stood there with his shoulders squared and his gaze unwavering told me that he wasn't just defending me. He was making it clear that this kind of treatment, in any form, was no longer acceptable in his home or in his presence. After a long, uncomfortable pause, Vivian managed a tight smile. "Fine," she said stiffly. "I won't make jokes like that again." It wasn't an apology, but it was the closest thing I was going to get that afternoon. Adrian nodded, then turned to me. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly. I gave him a small, genuine smile.
"I'm fine," I said. The rest of the afternoon passed without further incident, but the mood never quite recovered.
People kept talking and laughing, but there was a new awareness in the room, an unspoken understanding that something significant had just happened. When I left later that evening, Adrian walked me to the door. "You were right to set boundaries," he told me. "I should have enforced them from the beginning." Hearing him say that was worth more than any apology from Vivian could have been. I drove home, knowing that this was no longer just about me enduring comments or managing my reactions. It was about Adrian finally taking ownership of the space between us, refusing to let anyone, including his wife's family, undermine the respect I deserved. A few days later, I stopped by their house to drop off some homemade soup. I planned to just leave it at the door, but Adrian opened it before I could knock and insisted I come in for tea. Natasha was in the kitchen, and the tension was palpable, even before I stepped inside. Adrian's expression was calm, but there was a heaviness to it that told me they'd been having difficult conversations. We sat at the table with steaming mugs, and Adrian leaned forward, his hands flat on the surface. "We need to talk about what happened the other day," he said, looking directly at Natasha. She tensed immediately. "I already told you. It was a misunderstanding," she replied. Adrian slowly shook his head. "This isn't just about your mother. It's about you too." The air in the room changed. I stayed quiet, sipping my tea, letting him lead. "What about me?" Natasha asked, her tone defensive. "You smile and nod every time she makes one of those comments," Adrian said bluntly. "You don't step in, you don't stop her, and sometimes you even add to it. Do you have any idea how that makes my mother feel?" Natasha glanced at me, then back at him. "I'm not responsible for every word that comes out of my mother's mouth," she said firmly. "No," Adrian agreed, "but you are responsible for whether or not you support it. And the way you've been handling it makes it seem like you're on her side. You've been choosing sides against my mother, whether you mean to or not." I saw her face change, a flicker of something crossing her features before she straightened up. "I just don't like getting in the middle of things," she said quietly. "You've been in the middle since the day we got married," Adrian said, leaning back. "The only difference is that you've been choosing which side to stand on." The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Finally, Natasha spoke, her tone softer. "I didn't realize it was coming across that way," she said. "Well, now you do," Adrian replied, "and I need you to understand something. This is what's going to happen from now on. If my mother is in our house, she is treated with respect. If she's in the same room as your mother, the same rule applies. And if someone decides they can't follow that rule, they can leave. I'll pay the bill, and I'll walk them to the door. But I am not letting this happen anymore." It was a complete reversal of the power dynamic that had existed for months. His words turned the tables both figuratively and literally, establishing a new order that left no room for ambiguity. Natasha didn't argue. She just nodded slowly, as if she were finally beginning to understand that this wasn't going to go away. When I left that afternoon, the air felt different. I knew things wouldn't change overnight, but I also knew that the balance had fundamentally shifted. Adrian had taken the lead, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could walk into future gatherings without constantly bracing for impact. What I didn't know was that this new balance would soon be tested in a very public way, and the outcome would make it clear to everyone, friends, strangers, and family alike, that the rules had changed for good. The public test came on a bright Saturday at a local charity luncheon. Adrian had invited me to join them, mentioning there would be speeches, live music, and a buffet. He also mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that Vivian would be there. I hesitated, remembering the promise I'd made to myself. But Adrian's voice carried such conviction when he assured me things would be different that I agreed. The event was held in a spacious hall with elegant decorations and cheerful conversations filling the air. I arrived early and found Adrian near the entrance. He hugged me warmly, and I could feel the reassurance in that embrace. Natasha joined us shortly after, smiling politely. Vivian arrived just behind her, as impeccably dressed as always. She greeted me with a nod and a quick hello, before turning to speak with someone else. For the first part of the afternoon, everything was pleasant. We listened to speakers, applauded for performers, and made small talk with the other guests at our table. Adrian kept the conversation balanced, making sure I was included without making it obvious. Then, during the buffet, Vivienne approached me while Adrian was across the room. She glanced at my plate and said lightly, "I guess you don't eat like this at home. This must be quite a treat for you." It sounded harmless enough to anyone passing by, but I recognized the undertone immediately. Before I could even formulate a response, Adrian was at my side. He'd heard it. "We're not doing this," he said, his voice low but unmistakably firm. Vivienne blinked, clearly surprised he would react so directly at a public event. She started to protest, saying she was just joking, but he didn't let her finish. "You've been told before," he said, his voice still low but sharp. "If you can't speak respectfully, then keep your comments to yourself." A few people nearby glanced over, sensing the tension. Natasha quickly came over and asked what was wrong, but Adrian simply said, "Nothing worth repeating." Vivienne forced a smile and walked away without another word. The rest of the luncheon was polite but subdued, the conversation sticking to the safest of topics. When it was over, Adrian drove me home, and the silence between us was full of unspoken understanding. What I didn't know was that the next time we would all meet, it would be me who chose to speak, and the words I chose would forever change how they saw me. That moment came 2 weeks later, during a family dinner at their house. Adrian called it a chance to clear the air once and for all. It was just going to be him, Natasha, Vivienne, and me. No distractions, no escape routes. I almost said no, but I knew this conversation had to happen eventually. When I arrived, the tension was immediate. We sat down to eat, and for a few minutes we stuck to safe topics. But then Adrian put his fork down and said quietly, "We need to talk about how things have been going, and we need to do it honestly." He recounted what had happened at the luncheon, and made it clear that Vivienne's comment had crossed a line. He spoke calmly but firmly, reiterating that sarcasm at someone else's expense isn't humor. Vivienne's lips tightened. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone," she said. "It's just my way. And I'm telling you it doesn't work here. You're welcome in our home, but you need to respect everyone at this table." There was a pause, and then Natasha spoke. "I think you're making this a bigger deal than it is," she said quietly. "Mom and I have our way of talking. It might not be for everyone, but that doesn't mean it's cruel." That's when I spoke up. The heat rose in my chest, and I knew I couldn't stay silent any longer. "It's not about whether you think it's cruel," I said, my voice steady. "It's about how it feels to the person on the receiving end. And I'm telling you, it doesn't feel like a joke. It feels like I'm being singled out and diminished." Natasha's eyes met mine, and for a moment she didn't respond. Finally she let out a breath. "I didn't realize it was coming across that way," she said. "Well, now you do, so let's agree that it stops here." The room fell silent. No one tried to fill the uncomfortable space with small talk. It wasn't pleasant, but it was real. When the meal ended, I helped clear the table. Natasha and I worked side by side in tense silence, but there were no more digs, no more double meanings, just the sound of dishes and running water. When I left that night, Adrian walked me to the door. "It needed to happen," he said quietly. I nodded, feeling both exhausted and strangely relieved. 2 weeks after that dinner, Adrian called again. He said Vivienne wanted to apologize. The word felt significant, but his tone told me this wasn't going to be straightforward. We agreed to meet at a quiet coffee shop downtown. When she arrived, she was as composed as ever, her smile polite but distant. After we ordered, she got right to the point. "I understand there's been some tension," she began, "and I want to apologize if you took my comments the wrong way." The words landed exactly as I'd feared. It wasn't a real apology. It was a reframing that made it about my reaction rather than her behavior. "I appreciate you saying that," I said carefully. "But I need to be clear that this isn't about me taking things the wrong way. It's about how they were said and how they made me feel." She nodded slowly, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. "I see," she said. "It's just that I've always been sarcastic. People who know me understand that." "That may be true," I replied. "But when someone tells you something hurts, the intent doesn't erase the impact." Her smile faded slightly. "Well, I suppose I can try to be more careful, she said. But you have to understand, I'm not going to change who I am. There it was again, that subtle refusal to take real responsibility. We finished our coffee with shallow conversation, and when we parted ways, I knew this meeting had been about checking a box, rather than genuine change. On the drive home I made peace with that. I didn't need her to like me, or even fully understand me. I just needed her to know there were lines she couldn't cross without consequences. The next family gathering was another barbecue at Adrian's house. It was the first time I'd seen Vivian since the coffee shop. I went without illusions, but with my resolve firmly in place. During a conversation about gardening, Vivian made a comment about people who don't have much else going on. It was almost identical to previous remarks. This time I didn't hesitate. I looked directly at her and said, "Actually, I have plenty going on. Gardening is something I make time for because it's important to me, and I'd appreciate it if we could keep this conversation respectful." The mood shifted immediately. Adrian paused by the grill, a look of pride on his face. Vivian's smile tightened, but she didn't reply. She just took a sip of her drink and looked away. For the rest of the afternoon she kept her distance. There were no more comments, no more veiled insults. Later, as we cleaned up, Adrian came over to me. "I saw what happened," he said quietly. "You handled that perfectly." I shrugged, trying to keep my tone light. "I just told the truth." But inside I knew it was more than that. It was the first time I'd addressed her behavior in the moment without waiting for anyone else to step in. It felt like reclaiming something I'd been giving away for too long, my right to stand up for myself without apology. If you feel my words, show your support by liking the video and subscribing to the channel, and tell me from which city you belong, so I can see how far a woman's impactful voice can reach. Help me build this community so we can bring more truthful stories for you. The final decisive moment came unexpectedly during a casual Saturday afternoon gathering at their house. Natasha had invited a few friends over, and I'd stopped by to drop off some preserves. Adrian insisted I stay for tea. As I sat sipping my tea and listening to the conversation, one of the guests asked about my gardening. I started explaining my new greenhouse project, something I was genuinely proud of. That's when Vivian let out a light laugh and said, "Of course, when you have nothing better to do. Growing plants is the next best thing." The room went quiet. Before I could respond, Adrian set his cup down with a deliberate thud. "That's enough," he said, his voice quiet but carrying undeniable authority. He looked directly at Vivian. "We've talked about this, more than once. It's over." She blinked, caught off guard. "I was only joking," she said, forcing a smile. "No," Adrian replied firmly. "You were belittling her. You've done it before, and I'm not going to let it slide anymore. My mother has always treated you with respect, and she deserves the same in return. If you can't do that, then you're not welcome here." The guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. Natasha opened her mouth to intervene, but Adrian held up a hand without taking his eyes off Vivian. "I'm serious," he continued. "This is my house, and these are the rules. You will not cross them again." Vivian's expression shifted, but she didn't argue. The conversation cautiously resumed, though the energy had fundamentally changed. After the guests left, Adrian walked me to my car. "I meant it," he told me. "You're not going to have to deal with that ever again." I felt emotion well up, but I managed to smile. "I know," I said, "and I'm proud of you." Looking back now, those months feel like one long test of patience, dignity, and family loyalty. What started as small comments grew into a pattern that was only broken when boundaries were drawn and defended. I learned that silence can sometimes protect the peace, but other times it only feeds the problem. Speaking up, whether it was me at the barbecue or Adrian in front of his guests, wasn't about winning. It was about making it clear that respect is not negotiable. The biggest shift wasn't just in me. It was in Adrian. He went from being a silent observer to standing firmly by my side, even when it meant confronting people he cared about. Families don't always agree, and dynamics can be complicated. But when mutual respect becomes the rule, rather than the exception, the air gets lighter. And from that point on, I knew that table would never be the same again. I'm Amara, and this was my story. If it resonated with you, if you've ever felt invisible or diminished in your own family, know that you're not alone. Your voice matters, your boundaries matter, and sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply refuse to stay silent. Thank you for listening to my story. If you feel my words, show your support by liking the video and subscribing to the channel. And tell me from which city you belong, so I can see how far a woman's impactful voice can reach. Help me build this community so we can bring more truthful stories for you.